we're going to go over CSS selectors and pseudo selectors. Just some announcements. Homework 1 and 2. Homework 2 will be released after this lecture, but both of them are going to be due next Thursday. And then lab 1 will be due the following Monday. So that was the one that was assigned last Monday. This will be the same throughout the semester, but for office hours, just check the ed. All the TAs' days and times are listed there. And then if you are planning to visit, make sure you email them or email us like 12 hours in advance so we know to hold it. And then always feel free to it says email us for logistical questions, but post and ed, that's kind of like our main hub for communication. But you can also feel free to email us as well. And then if you haven't finished setting up your GitHub, that is the first thing you need to do. We'll be here until 8 to help with any debugging and just to help you get set up. Yeah, otherwise you can't really get your work done. This is the only way you can submit your homework. So that is first priority. Okay. So moving on. This is just an HTML cheat sheet you can refer to. I'm not going to read through it. It's pretty wordy, but if you at any point you forget what certain tags do, what properties they have, feel free to refer to this. This is also good for general formatting. As you can see, this follows the format of, pretty much any basic HTML document, where we still have the head tag and the body tag followed right after with its corresponding content. I'm not going to get into that too much because today we will be doing CSS. Oh, this is just a note. Whenever you're linking things, whether it's an image or a CSS file or a JavaScript file, always use your relative paths rather than absolute paths, which if you got your image up for homework 1, that means you've already done that. And yes, today is the CSS portion. Okay, so just a table of contents, what we're going to go over. The first part is just getting your CSS file linked with your HTML file. So your HTML file knows which CSS file it's going to reference when it comes to stylizing or when it comes to styling. We're going to go over some syntax so you can get familiar with how to read and write CSS. And then selectors and pseudo selectors, which we will get into. So the first one. So maybe this looks familiar, but this is an example of maybe a project workspace where you have your index.html file off to the side, and then your assets folder within which you have maybe your images, maybe scripts, which we haven't done yet, and styles. And this is where your CSS files will live. Okay. And so the question we'll have is, how does the HTML file know where to find its CSS? Well, basically in the head tag, remember at the top of the HTML document, we're going to include this link tag. Some things you don't really need to know how to do. Rel style sheet and type equals text/CSS. This is something you can just copy and paste. This won't change. Whereas the href, this is referencing the path to get to the CSS file from your index.html file. So if you've already started homework 1, this is the exact same process you've done for linking your image, this time just directing it to your CSS file. Okay. And yeah, again, you can just copy and paste this section. But this, for the href, make sure that this is appropriate for your project workspace. If, for example, you had, I don't recommend this, but if you had your CSS file in your images folder, again, don't do that. Then instead of styles, we would have images. So make sure you correct this to however your folders are set up. Okay. But for the sake of this class, please put it in assets and styles. Okay, that was it for linking CSS. For syntax, let's get into this. This is an example of a CSS selector. So there's a lot of things going on here, but just imagine this as a single chunk with multiple parts. The first part here is, you might recognize H1 as an HTML tag or element, as we'll call it. This tells the CSS that this is what we're going to style. Specifically, H1 will be styled a certain way, okay? And within our curly braces, this is where we specify both the properties and the values we want those properties to take on. For example, a certain property could be the color. Let's say you want to change the text color of all big headers, right? What we'll do is we'll write the property followed by a colon, followed by what we want that property to be, and a semicolon at the end. This is just standard syntax. Or maybe you want to change the background. In this case, we'll write background, colon, and then the color. We'll get back to this later, but this is an example of a CSS selector. Okay, so yeah, essentially we're telling the HTML like what elements to select, right? That's hence the name, and apply certain properties to. In these cases, or at least for this example, we're going to style a div. If we recall from the first lecture, a div doesn't have any inherent properties or any attributes attached to it. It's very just like nameless and there for organization. But what's nice is now with the power of CSS, we can take a div and tell it we want certain properties attached to it. So again, we're selecting all div elements. So anything in your HTML file that's within a div tag will be styled this way. And so, for example, this one will specify a font size of 32 pixels and the color green. Okay. So right, property and value. We're going to refer to these terms. The property is this, the actual attribute that we want to change. And then the value is like the value of said property. So pretty straightforward. And again, the value will specify what we want it to be or how we're changing it. Okay. Yeah, just a small thing. Pretty much all the rules for a CSS selector live in the curly braces. So if we were to read this as a single cohesive CSS file, we'll see that the div is styled this way only by these rules, and then images can be styled this way. So that's how you kind of like group things. Oh, and then also in CSS, as opposed to HTML, if we recall from HTML, comments have the like opening caret followed by some hyphens, and CSS comments will look like this. So / asterisk, whatever text you want to include, and then followed by asterisk and a /. Okay, so this is maybe an example of a CSS file that's linked to an HTML file. We see that the link does exist within the head, as we indicated before, and maybe style.css looks something like this. So just to break it down, let's see what we're doing here. So we're saying all divs will have this width, we'll have a background color of beige, and we'll have the text color of dark blue. Okay, and all headers, or sorry, H1s, will have the font size of 32 pixels, and we'll take on the font of Arial. Okay, so let's see what, sorry, can I click on it? Okay, we'll see this in practice now. So again, the same exact code that we broke down. Okay, cool. And it'll output this. And this is exactly what we should expect given this HTML on the side. So we can see everything is wrapped within a div. So anything that applies to a div will apply to everything inside. Likewise, everything within H1 will take on the properties specified here. And that's exactly what we see. We see that everything in the div has a background color of beige, has a text color of dark blue, but only the header has the font of Arial because we only specified that for H1. Whereas the other text that says let's learn CSS is in the P tag, and we didn't specify anything for the P tag within the CSS. Therefore, it'll just take on its default values. Before we move on, do we have any questions on this? Yes.
What happens if you have conflicting assignments?
Okay, so conflict.
The H1.
Oh, okay, cool. So for like conflicts or like overriding rules that maybe apply to the same element, there's something called specificity, which we'll actually cover a little further into the lecture. So let's see, where should we go? So just moving forward. Oh, sorry, that's not it. Wait. Okay. And yeah, this is just kind of drawing the connections between what is going on. Okay. So into selectors a little more. What if, consider the case where we don't want all the tags to take on the same style. So maybe we want to differentiate between, notice how everything here is a P tag, but within that we have written green text, blue text, and then more green text. If we were to write this, for example, so a CSS selector applying to the P element with color green and color blue, this does not work. right? Because we're giving it conflicting information. This makes like no sense. So this won't work, but instead maybe we have a solution. So the solution here is what we call classes. Essentially within your HTML document, you can specify a class, right? So this is how we would write that. We could say class within the opening tag, class equals, and then in quotes, green. And we can write that for these as well. And it's essentially letting us apply a set of rules to like multiple elements, but we can have a little more control as to where those rules are applied. And yes, make sure you add the class attribute to the opening tag. And before, when we saw CSS selectors applied to a tag, we just wrote like actually what the tag is, how it's written. Whereas when we're referring to a class and we want to style an HTML class, we'll have to put a period before that, indicating we're not looking for a green tag, rather we're looking for the green class. I might have said a lot there, so we can revisit that. But essentially now, we're not caring whether it's a p tag or a div tag. We're just looking at the class, and therefore everything with the class green will be colored green. And so everything here would be displayed as green. Any questions on this? Okay. And we'll see more like concrete examples, so this will make more sense. The next thing we'll look at is IDs. IDs essentially are formatted like the same way as classes. Instead of class, we have ID. And essentially, it's the same thing. We're applying rules to distinct elements on the page. And yeah, it's everything is pretty much the same, except in the CSS file, we write hashtag or like the pound sign rather than the period. Okay, we will come back to the slide in a second. So now going back to this example where maybe we want this text to be green, this text to be blue, and then this text to be green again. One way we could do that is by indicating a class of green on the first and third and an ID of blue on the second. In the corresponding CSS file, we'll style all things in the green class green and all things with a blue ID as blue. So you might be thinking, why is there even a distinction between classes and IDs if they're like functionally equivalent or somewhat redundant? The purpose of this is to kind of be more specific with how you reference your HTML elements. So for the problem of overriding certain things, it takes us to the the topic of specificity. When you style a tag, let me go back to this real quick. Okay, cool. When you have conflicting rules, tags that are defined, when you have conflicting rules for an element or a tag that's defined for the tag, I'm like reading these notes and I'm just gonna like free speech this. This doesn't make sense. Essentially, there's like a hierarchy in terms of what things are chosen when you're styling something. The hierarchy at the very lowest level is the tag. Above that goes the class, and at the very top is the tag. So if you have a certain style for a tag, did I say tag? I meant ID. If you have a certain style for an ID and a certain style for a tag, and a certain element has both that same tag and ID, the thing that's going to be chosen will be the ID because that is at the top of the hierarchy. So for example, maybe we can change this. Let's say in this CSS file, I had like P, and then within the curly braces, I had like color equals green or color : green. Notice both of these rules apply to this single element here, but the one that's taken will be the one that applies to the tag or the ID. I'm so sorry, I keep saying that wrong. Do you have a question?
If one specifies, let's say blue, and the other specifies gold, will the both combine or?
Yeah, so if they don't conflict, then they'll combine. But if there are conflicting ones, then you'll take the one with the highest hierarchy. So again, at the top, from top to bottom is IDs, classes, and tags. Okay, we'll move forward. And so one thing you can do to kind of make your CSS code a little more concise, if you do want to select multiple elements with multiple classes and style them all the same, instead of making 3 different like blocks, you can combine them this way. Essentially, remember class, we'll refer to that with a period at first, and you can combine them by adding a comma at the end and then writing the next one. So if we want to include the class 1, class 2, and ID 3, we can combine it as such. And make sure you separate them with a comma and a space. It's like very particular. If you don't include that exact formatting, the code might not work. Okay. So one other thing we can do here with class names is you can give tags more than one class. So for example, if we want this text here to not only apply to the class or exist in the class green, but we also want it to be big, within the quotes, if you add a space, you're essentially telling the HTML that it is both in the green class and the big class. So that's a way to like combine it within the HTML. And yeah, there's no space if you want to refer to two like classes here. You wouldn't include a space. Yeah, and so what this is saying is all elements that have both green and big, style it this way. The difference between this and the previous slide is this one is it can be one, or it can be two, or it can be three, and all combinations of those three. Whereas this one has to be both green and big. Right? So this one is a little more selective in that sense. Okay. And so, yeah, in this example, the CSS will apply to the first P tag, but not the second, because big, this one is lacking with the green class. Okay. One other thing you can do is select nested elements. And the way you would write that is you just put a space between the two elements. And so we see that we have a div with the ID J, and then within that div, we have a P tag with a class park. So the way we could reference that in the CSS is as such. So notice what we're trying to illustrate in this example is that the CSS will style this text, but not the bottom one, because this is combining classes, whereas this one is indicating like a nesting system between a tag and a class. Yeah, sorry, there's a lot of content, but you can always like revisit these slides. Also at the end, we'll include like a CSS like cheat sheet so that all these rules, all these like finicky like syntax things are all in one place. You don't have to like keep going back and forth, because it is definitely a lot to remember, and we don't expect you to like remember it all the time. Okay, and the very last thing is something called pseudo-selectors. We can see that this will refer to a div, so that's still the same. But if we follow it with a colon and some specific word, essentially what we're doing is we're selecting elements that are under a certain like state. So this allows for user interaction, and as this kind of implies, when you hover over a div, it'll be styled this way. And so yeah, the general structure for a pseudo selector is the normal selector, so whatever HTML element or class or ID that you want to refer to, colon, and then the class of the pseudo class. And so notice before, if we didn't have the hover, divs would automatically be formatted this way. When we write colon hover, this will only follow its format when that div is being hovered over. So we'll see some other examples of pseudo selectors, pseudo classes. So the common one is hover. Another one that you might have like interacted with before on web pages is visited. So this one will activate when a link has been visited. So if you like click on it, it directs you to the link. You go back to the page and maybe it's like a different color. Maybe it goes from like blue to like some faded purple. That can be done using the visited pseudo class. An active one, this refers to when a mouse actively or like currently clicks on that element. For example, going back to this, if we had like div colon active, it would style the div this way when we like click on it. So that's how pseudo selectors work. It just allows for web pages to have a little more interactivity only using CSS. And then if you are curious, you can click on this link and it'll direct you to like a bunch of other pseudo classes. Okay, so in summary, CSS we're using to change the default appearance of HTML. As we saw before, we could use different tags like H1 or P or the unordered list UL. But it's very restricting, and CSS allows you to like expand how you want your web page to be styled and personalize it to your needs. And yes, this all lives in a separate file. So that's one more file you have to make. It's not just HTML, but we're also including a CSS. This is just a little reference for you to use later. Make sure the path is correct. In this case, the path is probably not correct. And yeah, this is just the standard format of CSS. In summary for the selectors, everything that we covered, which I kind of did rapid fire, so I'll open it up to questions in a sec. When you're trying to apply CSS to a certain HTML tag, right, you just put the name of the tag and then all the rules within. If you're trying to apply the CSS to a class of elements, make sure you add the dot in front of it. If it's referring to a specific element or an ID, make sure it is the hashtag. And when we say one specific element, what we're really saying here is like we're trying to reference an ID. And then to apply CSS to multiple things, you can combine it using your commas. Notice here, you might be wondering why these don't have periods. H1 and H2, remember, are tags, and we don't need the period for tags, whereas this hashtag special heading may refer to an ID. Okay. Another thing for pseudo-selectors, if you're trying to style something like a link, for example. Oh, right. This is A is just the HTML tag for a link. That's all that's saying. If you're trying to hover over a link and you want maybe to indicate to a user that, hey, this is a link and this is like something that'll change when you click on it. If you add this hover pseudo-selector and the user hovers over it, it should style it with a little underline. These are all things you actually have probably interacted with before. And then, yeah, these two are the ones we went over. If you want something to change when you click on it, you'll use active. And then if you want it to indicate that it's been visited before or clicked on, or sorry, yeah, just visited before, you'll use visited. And this kind of just goes over the different like CSS properties that exist. There are way more. There's like, I have no idea how many CSS properties there are, but this is just a few common ones you might see and use. Each one kind of refers to a different like category. So anything to do with text is here. Anything to do with like size and spacing of your actual elements is here. And then to make the generic like box a little prettier, you can mess with these properties here. And yes, okay, so pretty much for all the slides that you've seen so far, we've used like very like generic color names, things like blue, green, light blue. If you need to use a specific color, you can copy over, I don't know, some of you may have used hex codes before, but you can just refer to this Google color picker, find the exact shade and like hue that you need, click on that, and then it'll display, where is it? It'll display like the hex code, which is specific to any particular color. And then you can use that instead of like blue or green. And then, yeah, these are links that we strongly recommend when you're like diving into CSS for the first time. The first thing here is like just practice. So it's very interactive and like tests your knowledge of like CSS syntax. This one here, this is just like a selectors cheat sheet. This one is also just like gamifying practice. That's all that is. And then this is a cheat sheet for like CSS properties. So like what things can you change with CSS? Okay, that was a lot. What questions do we have? Or what things do you want to like revisit? I'll go back to the summary. Any questions on like maybe application? A lot of these, I think, become more familiar once you just actually see how they're used. So right now it's okay if this feels very like hand wavy, but once you see it applied to an actual like web page, you'll see that, oh, okay, certain things are useful in certain ways that might not be like obvious right now. But otherwise, that's all I have. You can also ask Kelly for questions if you think of them. But yeah, that's it. Should we move on to design?
Yeah.
All right.